Hello, good evening, Pak Allen.
Good evening.
How are you, Pak Allen? Sehat-sehat?
Wonderful.
Okay. I hope we always in good condition, Pak Allen, and our students in here. I will start this discussion. Baik, teman-teman, ladies and gentlemen, our participants in this discussion. I hope you can turn on the cam so we can have a warm discussion with Pak Allen. Ya, sudah ada di sini. Silakan teman-teman sekalian yang bisa bergabung dengan menyalakan kamera. Yuk kita diskusi di sini, kita santai aja, tidak perlu terlalu tegang, gitu ya. Oke. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good evening, our honorable guest, Pak Allen Hicken. Thank you for your come in this discussion. Ya. I'm sorry, Pak Allen, my English is not too fluent. Nanti mungkin bisa dibantu oleh teman-teman yang ada di sini, begitu ya. Oke. We are very happy. We have a special guest, special speaker for about an hour, ya, selama 1 jam ke depan. We will discuss about a very interesting topic, teman-teman sekalian, our friend, and let me introduce our guest speaker tonight, Pak Allen Hicken, atau Mr. Allen. Mr. Allen is a professor in political science in Michigan University, Mr. Allen. Okay, Michigan University, and Pak Allen is very productive intellectuals. Pak Allen writes so many books and journals and book chapters, teman-teman, especially in comparative politics and electoral system. Yeah, so we can learn a lot from Pak Allen, especially in electoral topics and so on. Yeah, and your latest publication is a book chapter, if I'm not mistaken, with Pak Ed Aspinall about Indonesia's democracy, regression or stagnation. Is that right, Pak Allen?
That is one of the recent ones. My most recent one is actually a book with Ed Aspinall, Meredith Weiss, and Paul Hutchcroft on money politics in Southeast Asia.
I see. Okay. Ini menarik, teman-teman. Jadi beliau beliau publikasi terakhir sudah diterjemahkan ke bahasa Indonesia, already translated in bahasa. Judulnya adalah Demokrasi Indonesia, Stagnasi atau Regresi. Bisa teman-teman dapatkan di toko buku terdekat. Itu sangat menarik. Nanti kita akan request Pak Allen to probably share his ideas and views on it. Begitu ya. Baik. And let me introduce Pak Allen. Our participant tonight mostly came from our students in Yogyakarta State University. Teman-teman dari from Communication Science Department. Ya. Today we will learn about political communication, Pak Allen, especially. They are very glad to have you here, and they want to discuss about your ideas, about your publication, especially building party systems. And probably your latest publication will be good if you discuss and share with us. Okay, Pak Allen, for our start, yeah. Can you share to us? Can you tell to us why are you interested in Southeast Asian studies, and probably what make you interested in studying about Indonesia's democracy nowadays? Can you share your story and view to us?
Sure. Well, first I need to start with 2 apologies. So first, my Indonesian is I speak Thai and I speak Khmer, but I don't speak any Indonesian except for terima kasih, and so I appreciate your patience with me. I'll try to speak slowly, but I speak quickly when I get excited. So thank you for your patience as I muddle through in English. Second, I need to apologize to Professor Riza and Fikri and any of you who were here last week. They were very clear on the time. I apparently can't use a calendar, and so I put it in my calendar for the wrong time. And so I apologize for anybody who was here last week waiting for me to show up. I was very embarrassed and felt bad to miss that, and glad we could reschedule. So on the question about so why Southeast Asia and why elections and democracy, and it's a great question. It comes down to sort of two things. So first, my interest in Southeast Asia grew out of work I had done in college with Cambodian refugees, and I went to work in Cambodia after that, and became very interested in the ways in which in government performance. So when do governments deliver things that the citizens need and citizens want? What kinds of political institutions produce the best kinds of outcomes for citizens? So we can think about those outcomes being democratic outcomes. We can think about them in terms of public policy, public goods provision, social services. So I wanted to understand how political institutions shape the delivery of public goods and services, and particularly under democracies and new democracies. So my work is mostly focused on Indonesia, Thailand, and the Philippines, but with people like and others. I've worked also in Indonesia and Malaysia, Singapore, Timor-Leste, and Cambodia. So so that's where my interest comes from. But it's part of this lifelong quest to understand, how do we make, does democracy work? How do we make it work better, right? Those are the two questions that really sort of animate what I'm wanting to do. And then I focus in my own work a lot on political parties and elections as one part of the democratic institutional apparatus.
Okay, it's interesting, Pak Alan, and how you make a networking and collaboration with another prolific intellectuals, to study about democracy in Southeast Asia. And then we talk about your findings in building party system. Can you share to us what's the main point of your findings about the democracy in Thailand, democracy in Philippines, and its comparison with Indonesia's democracy?
Great question. So the can I share my screen for just a minute? Would that be possible? Let me just show you a couple of things that might be helpful there.
Sure, sir. Okay.
Let's see. So
okay.
Can you see that? Okay. Let's see.
Okay.
Yeah,
it's clear.
Yeah. So I'm just gonna skip through here and just get you just show you a couple of figures. So just as a baseline. So this is a little messy, but this is democracy in across Southeast Asia and Japan. Let me just we'll break it down a little bit so it's a little easier to see. Hang on. So this is so if you think about democracy in Southeast Asia, we can compare it to Japan. This is a measure from VDEM that goes from 0, no democracy, to 1, sort of full liberal democracy. Japan sort of sitting here. In Southeast Asia, we have a bunch of countries that are what we call closed autocracies. So they either don't have elections or they have elections where there's only one party allowed. And so we'd have, Vietnam would be in that category. Laos would be in that category. Cambodia, largely in that category, had a little bit of a democratic opening in the early 90s, and then kind of came back down. And then we have a bunch of countries that are what we'd call sort of electoral autocracies. So they're elections, but the elections aren't free and fair. The playing field is not fair. So think Indonesia under Suharto, but currently we have countries like Malaysia with a little bit of improvement recently, Singapore, And then Myanmar, for most of its history, was a closed autocracy. We had this democratic opening, so it became at least with elections that were not completely free and fair, but more free and fair. And then, of course, after 2020, it would fall back off. And then we have countries that have had periods of what we call electoral democracy. So elections are free and fair. Opposition parties compete. There may be problems with the democracy, but the elections are at least free and fair. And so that would be the Philippines post Marcos, although with some declines of Duterte. Indonesia is the best example. So these are the Sukarno and Suharto years, and then this wonderful democratic opening after the fall of Suharto, but with challenges, of course, in recent years, as we'll probably talk about. And then we have Timor-Leste, which has democratized, and then Thailand bouncing all over the place. Thailand democratic and then not democratic, kind of going back and forth. So I guess one of the questions is why these differences? And one of the interesting things I think for Thailand and comparing Thailand to say Indonesia and the Philippines, Thailand struggled, so we can talk about the problems and the challenges to Indonesian democracy. Thailand struggled much more than either Indonesia and the Philippines. And I think it comes down to, among other things, the fact that in Thailand, there are real questions about what I call the fundamental pillars of democracy. So the fundamental pillars are two things. So losers' consent and winners' restraint. In order for democracy to work, you have to have, let's talk about the first one, losers' consent. In order for democracy to work, you have to have actors agree to play by the rules of the game, even when they lose under those rules, right? They can't take their toys and go home when they lose. So you want actors who, when they lose an election, they're disappointed, they're critical of the winner of the election, they see the winner of the election as their opponents, but they don't see the winner of the election as their enemies, as illegitimate. So we look at the rhetoric coming out of elections by the losers, and what do they say? If the rhetoric is, again, disappointment, criticism, that's fine. But if the rhetoric is about the opposition being illegitimate, if they see themselves as an insurgency and they try to overturn the election or oust the winner of the election from power, that is really worrying. So you want actors who, in order for democracy to work, you need the major actors to want to have the following preferences. You want them to say, okay, I want a democracy where I win, if everybody wants to win. But if I can't get a democracy where I win, I'll take a democracy where you win. And if I can't get that, and I prefer both of those things to a non-democracy. The challenge in Thailand is there are groups who have different preferences, who come to have, and frankly, some people in my own country have these same preferences, where democracy is great if I win. If I can't get democracy where I win, then I prefer to have non-democracy where I win. And if I can't get that, then I'll live with non-democracy where nobody wins, where neither of us wins. And I'd prefer all of those outcomes over democracy where I lose and you win. So Thailand's really struggled with that to a degree that Indonesia and the Philippines have not. So there's been shades of that a little bit with Prabowo when he lost at first, not being willing to accept the results, but then later joining the government. So Indonesia's never had that moment where the loser of the election declared the elections completely invalid and refused to recognize the winner as a legitimate winner of the election. On the other side of that is winner's restraint. So democracy doesn't last if, when the winner gets in power, they use the powers of their office to try and make sure that they never ever lose again, right? If they use the powers of their office to attack their opponents, to centralize political power, to punish and seek out those opponents. And in Thailand, that's also been a challenge over its history. So now we expect that incumbents are always going to want more power. That's just part of politics. But there are things that make it easier or harder for them to do that. So institutions that check the attempts to grab power, power sharing arrangements, regular elections where they may actually lose. All those things can help reduce the ability of those kinds of politicians like that to attack their enemies. And strong parties is one of that. So stronger parties is better for democracy than weaker parties. That's a long answer to your question, but that's my first thought.
It's interesting about what happened in Thailand's democracy, Pak Allen. So we can like conclude or extract your findings that Thailand actually have probably a kind of ersatz democracy or what is that? Demokrasi semu, teman-teman ya. Jadi kalau kita lihat demokrasi di Thailand itu adalah kalau saya menang maka saya akan mempercayai demokrasi, tapi kalau saya kalah mending kalah semua. Jadi so it's like okay, it called democracy, but I must win like that, Pak Allen, or maybe my conclusion still need correction about.
No, I think that's an interesting way to put it. So I guess what we'd want to do, and I'm happy to go into a lot of detail, but just to give the broad outlines. So what happens in Thailand is, you have decades of militaries coming in and out of power until the 1980s, really. And then in 1980s, we have a period of time with a quick coup in 1991, but a period of time when there's democratic elections. The challenge in those elections is that political parties, there's lots of political parties. Those parties are really weak. Voters have no connections to those parties. Lots of party switching. In some ways, sounds somewhat like Indonesia today. And lots of not really much focus on public policy, lots of vote buying, lots of patronage and the like. Again, sounds a little bit like some criticisms of Indonesia today. What happens though in 1997 is there's an attempt to, and I talk about this in the book, an attempt to reform Thailand's constitution, a new constitution passed that is aimed at reforming Thailand's party system in part. And as a result of that, and we can talk about exactly what those reforms were, but the results of that were twofold. So first, the number of parties dramatically drops in Thailand. So Thailand moves from having these large multi-party coalition governments that again look similar to Indonesia, although not a presidential coalition. So the parties, with parties that had governments that had 4, 5, 6 parties, 7 parties in them, and those governments didn't last very long. So Thailand, again, is a parliamentary system, not a presidential system. And so governments can rise and fall without elections. And so government cabinets in that period, 80s and 1990s, would last on average 18 months. And then the government would fall, a new cabinet would be formed. But that changes after 1997 in the first election under that new constitution. Thaksin Shinawat's party, the Thai party, nearly wins a majority. Just a couple seats shy of majority, and then another party joins with it and it gets a majority. And then it wins a landslide in 2005. And so you have this dramatic change in Thai politics where we go from winner take some to winner take all. And one party that looks like it can win every election, and the opposition, which is now completely shut out of power. And that starts to change the calculation. So the losers, which include the conservative parties in Thailand, the military, the bureaucracy, they decide they don't like democracy as much now that they don't have a shot to win. And so they begin to change their preferences. And Thaksin reinforces that by trying to consolidate power and punish his opponents. And so the political dynamics change quite dramatically, and the coups happen, which just reinforce some of those challenges. So yeah, so that we have this sort of yo-yo back and forth in Thai democracy, but the sort of real key moment of change is that constitutional reform and the change of Thailand from a multi-party system with really weak parties to a two-party system really with a majority party that was pretty strong that could command loyalty from voters from election to election. That just changes the nature of the political game. And it turns out that there's a set of actors in Thailand who don't like playing that game if they don't have a shot to win.
Wow, interesting, the dynamics of politics and election in Thailand. And I spotted that the pattern of patronage between the politician and the electorates or the voters is quite similar with Indonesia. Maybe Pak Alan, during your observation or your field research in Thailand, what kind of patronage of or relation between the voters and the politician that you find that it's unique? Probably, can you recall it and share it to us?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm going to share my screen again one more time if I can, just because there's a fun. I'm going to show you a picture here that helps kind of illustrate that. So hang on, let me just find the right picture. 1 second. Okay, let's see. Okay, there we go. So we often see. So I've just, and I have to confess, I've just finished a large project with. Can you see my screen? Oh no, not yet. Okay.
Still not upping. Yeah.
Let's try it now. Okay. So I've just finished this big project with Ed Aspinall, Meredith Weiss, and Paul Hutchcroft, where we looked at money politics, patronage, vote buying across Southeast Asia. And you'll recognize some of these pictures. These are from Indonesia, of course. Voters giving, this is from the Philippines. So this is a list of voters with the cash that they're going to give voters. This is, these are some young girls taking money and folding them into little envelopes to go give candidates in the Philippines as well. And in Indonesia, we saw a lot of this as well. We had candidates who brought out their books and said, "Here's all my voters, here's all my brokers, my team success workers, and here's who I'm going to give how much to." So we studied a lot about that. So these are handouts given to individual voters, and we see this very common in Indonesia, very common in Thailand. In Philippines. Common in Thailand, but has changed over time. And I'll talk about that in a minute. One of the things that's changed in Thailand oops, let me go the wrong way. There you go. Are things like this. So you recognize this in Indonesia. So politicians give money to individuals, but they also provide, we sometimes call it patronage or pork if we're not in Indonesia. We call it club goods, local public goods. These are things services that politicians try to provide to boost their name, show voters that they're generous, try and get voters to think of them favorably. So this things like ambulances or notary services or helping repair the mosque roof or prayer mats to women's groups or women's studies groups or things like that, right? All kinds of different things. In Thailand, this is very common as well. Let me just give you an example. This was a road that I used to live on in Thailand. They're called sois, kind of little alleys in Thailand. And I came home one day from some interviews, and I noticed that the road had been repaved, and you can kind of see that here. A new road was put on, and it was great because the old road had been very bad. It was very dangerous to ride on. I'd ride on the back of a motorcycle, and I'd be bouncing up and down. So I was very happy to see this, but it was kind of strange because they only paved up to here on the road, and the end of the road is just right up here where these trees are. So that was sort of strange. Why didn't they pave this whole road? And I asked my wife, did they run out of material? No, the truck was still pretty full. Did they run out of time? Well, they left pretty early in the day. So I kept expecting them to come back, but they never did. So they left this part of the street unpaved, which again was sort of strange. And I was trying to understand, why would you do that? It was, you had the truck, you had the people, why not pave the whole road? And the clues were this sign, right? The clue is this sign right here. So all along where they had paved this road, there is this sign, and the sign says in Thai, these road improvements are brought to you by, Sa is the abbreviation for a member of parliament. For your these road improvements are brought to you by your member of parliament, Puvanida Kumplin. This is the name of your MP. So Puvanida Kumplin had produced these, had brought this road to this particular area, and it turns out that Puvanida Kumplin's electoral constituency ends right here. That was so right past this truck was where her constituency ended, and so she wasn't going to pave over here where her constituents were not. This was the pretty standard practice. And you'll notice that on Puvanida's sign here, no mention of political parties, no mention of anything but herself. She wants voters to understand that, that she is responsible. So in Thailand, through the 80s and 1990s, much like Indonesia today, actually, the goal of these kinds of things was to create a personal support network, to get people who were loyal to you personally, to build a personal brand. Because parties were so weak, and you were competing in Thailand during the 80s, 90s, like in Indonesia, you were competing not just against people from the other party, but you were competing against people from your own party, right? This is open list PR. In Thailand, it was a different system, but similar dynamics. So I couldn't say to voters, vote for me because I'm a member of the Purple Party, because there's going to be 3 or 4 other people in my constituency that are also members of the Purple Party. That's not going to set me apart. So I have to say, vote for me because I brought you this road, or vote for me because I did these. I provided an ambulance for the community, or because I gave you 500,000 rupiah, or vote for me because I'm from this area and you know my family. It has to be something personal. So that was, again, very much like Indonesia today and the Philippines. That was Thailand through the 1980s, 1990s. One of the things that starts to happen in the 2000s as a result of these reforms is that party labels start to become more important. Again, this is similar to Indonesia prior to 2009. So so candidates start to use party label when they campaign. They start to tell, it becomes an asset for them to say, they still want to do good things for voters, but now they say, vote for me because I'm a member of this party, and that begins to mean something. And voters begin to attach some value to party label. So we have those things like vote buying and patronage don't disappear, but they become less important in voters' decisions. So voters become more driven by party and more driven by party policies than by handouts. And we can look at that, we can measure that in lots of different ways. Voters have multiple votes in Thailand, and they stop splitting their votes. They start casting their votes for the same party for both votes. Candidates again start to campaign on those party labels and start to put the party as a prominent part of the poster where they wouldn't have before. So that's the sort of state of affairs in the 2000s. In this last election in 2019, money politics makes a bit of a comeback, in part because the military party doesn't have a party reputation. The thing they have is money. And so they try and buy politicians and they try and buy voters with lots of patronage and lots of vote buying. And they're somewhat successful, but not completely successful at turning the clock back. Indonesia and the Philippines, of course, these kinds of activities are really ubiquitous. One of the things that makes one of the interesting differences between Indonesia and the Philippines on this regard is that in the Philippines, 2 things. So in Indonesia, the campaign organizations tend to be what we call ad hoc or temporary, team success, right? So you're a candidate, you build a team success with your team success members, your brokers, and you organize that for the election and then disappears, right, after the election. Very temporary. And as well, it's harder for politicians in Indonesia to get access to state resources to use for patronage and vote buying, harder for them than it is for Filipino politicians. The budget and the state is much more open to Filipino politicians. And so Indonesian politicians tend to concentrate their patronage and their vote buying right around election time. And they also use more of their own money rather than state resources compared to the Philippines. And the Philippines, politicians, especially incumbents, have much more access to state resources. So they use those state resources both to provide things like new roads and schools and access to healthcare and things like that at the local level. And then also use that money those things to generate kickbacks that they can use for vote buying. So much more of that, and it tends to be across all of the electoral cycle, not just around elections. The other thing that's different is that in the Philippines, the vote buying is done by local machines that tend to last over time. So they're built around usually a mayor, a bupati, or a governor, and they're often based around powerful families at the local level, and they tend to endure from election to election. So Indonesian politicians worry a whole bunch about their brokers cheating, their brokers taking the money and running, their brokers not working very hard for them, and they try and, for example, limit the number of names that brokers are going to put on a list because they don't trust the brokers actually know these people, that they're actually going to get the money to the people. Filipino politicians worry a lot less about that. They worry some, but they allow brokers to put more names on their lists. They do less monitoring of their brokers because those brokers are parts of these machines and they're going to last longer. So Filipino politicians often don't pay their brokers for the election. In Indonesia, they almost always pay their brokers, right? They're paid up front to work, then you expect that they're going to skim off the top. In the Philippines, you don't usually pay them up front, but they expect there's going to be other rewards. They'll be able to get jobs after the election. They'll get help in other ways. So it's an ongoing relationship. And as a result, you can actually see, we've done surveys and studies of this. Indonesian brokers don't work very hard for their candidates. So they don't usually talk about the candidate with voters. They often sign up voters without actually telling them they're on the list. They mostly sign up friends and family in their area. But Filipino brokers will spend more time with voters, will try and talk about the candidate. Filipino brokers are more likely to know the candidate than Indonesian brokers. Many Indonesian brokers don't know the candidate at all. So those are some interesting differences between those three cases anyway.
Wow, sir, it's a very, very interesting findings on three countries with probably a kind of similar pattern of patronage. Teman-teman, ini hampir mirip dengan apa yang terjadi di Indonesia, kan? Apa yang dijelaskan oleh Pak Allen tadi, ya, bagaimana how's the relations between politician and the voters and what we called as broker, teman-teman. Broker is a kind of tim sukses dalam bahasa kita, ya, tim ses, and probably in another area we called it pecut, ya. And it's very similar. I with Pak Ed Aspinal at the past have a project, Pak Allen, about elections, brokerage, and patronage in 2017 local election and in 2018 village election, and the pattern is still the same in Indonesia. Yeah, so it's quite interesting that why it's not shifting like in Thailand, ya, teman-teman. So in Thailand, at the past, party affiliation or party ID is not that important and not that significant. Itu tidak menjadi penting, teman-teman misalnya fanatik pada partai apa, you are fanatic in what kind of political parties, you will not identify yourself, I will not choose that party, yeah. But it's more like I will choose who want to give me like material incentive like that. But in Thailand nowadays, it already shifting. People see political party is something that important, ya. Sudah mulai memikirkan pentingnya memiliki preferensi atau keyakinan kepada partai. But in Indonesia, it still not works, ya. Ya, until now lah. We don't know when it will be a kind of improvement that party identification is important. Nah, it's very interesting, Pak Allen, about the relations between broker and then how they communicate and how that the pattern between Filipino broker and Indonesia broker, it's something new to us, that they will not they will only receive payment at the after the election, like something that more or less thing like jobs or projects, different situation in Indonesia that we should pay it at first, while we sign the contracts. I will be your team success and I will work for you, like that. Okay, probably Pak Allen, how if we give opportunity to our participant and student here, probably they have question or something to discuss with Pak Allen?
Certainly.
Okay, teman-teman semua, ladies and gentlemen, who want to discuss or who want to ask about our topic tonight to Pak Allen, silakan. Nanti nggak apa-apa kalau ada yang belum pede bahasa Inggris, bisa dibantu Rahma, mungkin nanti bisa bantu ya teman-teman untuk translate ya. Oke, Rahma, oke, silahkan.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear my voice?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. First, I'm going to say we, or at least I, haven't had a chance on getting a hold of your book yet, but I want to relate our discussion to our previous lectures from Mr. Fikri about political communication. Specifically, I would like to ask about the difference of the number of political parties, especially with America and other countries who has a two-party system, and compare it to countries like Indonesia and other countries with a multi-party system. Because when we talk about the number of political parties, of course, there are pros and cons in both of those types, but my question relates to the success of the election in terms of relationship with the public, because I know there are some Americans who are unsatisfied, or let's say critical of Americans' political parties, mainly because they don't identify themselves as part of a party who has two different, very strong ideologies. They feel limited and they don't feel like they connect. But people from Indonesia and other Southeast Asian countries who has a multi-party system also feels that way. So I'm wondering about the key factor to all of this in terms of relationship of political parties to the public, especially why the public now has a hard time following a political party, both in a multi-party system and a two-party system. Just an insight or a brief observation about the comparison of the two political parties and their relationship with the public from Mr. Hickens would be enough. Thank you.
Thanks, Rama. That's a great question. And I teach a whole course just about this question, so I guess it's going to be hard for me to be brief. But I love the way you said pros and cons. So let's think about this in two ways. So first, we can think about just the number of parties, and there you can have, very extreme, you have no parties or one party. That when that happens, that's not a democracy. But two parties to multiple parties. There is a worry. So on that dimension, we trade off. So as we go from at the two-party side, we're more likely to get majority governments. We tend to get really clear accountability. We know who to blame, who to credit for policies. There's very clear identifiability, who to blame or who to credit. So that maximizes accountability, maximizes identifiability. If I don't like what the president's done, I know what his party is and I can throw him out of office, right? And we move, but we have less representativeness. So there are fewer groups who feel represented, who feel close to the parties. There are fewer ideas around the table of policy making often. And there are fewer checks on that ability of the majority party to do what it wants to do. Again, trade-offs. As we go the other direction with more parties, we get more representativeness, more responsiveness, more seats around the table for more ideas, more parties for people to choose from, and that. But we also sacrifice decisiveness, how quickly governments can act, the ability of governments to sort of implement the largest parties to implement their agenda. It becomes harder to hold the government accountable because we can't just throw out the incumbent. We have to. There's a whole coalition, and even if the incumbent, if the incumbent loses seats, they may still be part of the next coalition. So that becomes more complicated. And again, you can think about Indonesia's cartel parties, right? The losers still often end up as part of the president's coalition. So accountability can be weaker there. You can get very extreme where you have so many parties that we kind of sometimes we call it pathological. So there's so many parties that you get lots of political instability. That was Thailand in the 80s, 1990s. That was in Italy during the same periods. That was the worry about Indonesia, and still some people complain that Indonesia is edging towards that as well. And one of the reasons why the designers of the Constitution try to limit, they keep raising the limit for the threshold for getting seats in Parliament to try and keep out really small parties. So you are exactly right, Rama, to say that more parties gives more choice to voters, but that's only one dimension on one of two dimensions about how close I feel to parties. So it's easier to find a party that's close to me if there's fewer parties, but those parties actually then there's more parties, but those parties actually have to stand for something. There actually have to be differences in order for me to say I'm closer to this one and farther away from this one. In Indonesia, in the Philippines, in pre-reform Thailand, that can sometimes be hard to do, right? These are parties of individuals, right? These are parties built around factions, but they don't differ very much in their ideology, and they haven't built often very close connections with voters. So there's a second dimension here, which is very party-centered environments where you have parties that have meaningful labels, that have programmatic ideologies that are different from each other, that have strong connections with voters, and systems that are very person-centered, where candidates do most of the work. Party labels are pretty meaningless, and there's not really much difference between parties on important policies. So where Indonesia sits right now, right, on the few parties, lots of parties dimension, it's over here. But on the strong parties, weak parties dimension, it's over here. So it's kind of sitting in this quadrant over here. So even though there's lots of parties to choose from, voters don't feel like they have a choice because because they don't feel attached to those parties. Those parties aren't very different from one another. Those parties haven't invested in grassroots party building. And so people are still dissatisfied. So Americans are dissatisfied because they're over on this side. Indonesians are satisfied because they're over on this side, and it's probably healthy for both to move somewhere towards the middle. So Indonesian parties becoming a little stronger, American parties becoming, Americans having a few more choices, the number of parties. And Thailand used to be exactly where Indonesia was. Thailand became fewer parties, and those parties became a bit stronger. Now, that caused its own problems, but that is, thinking about those two dimensions, I think, helps us think about the trade-offs involved for voters. And it's interesting, Indonesia and Thailand kind of changed places. 2004 election, parties were pretty strong. And in fact, I've got the graphic in front of me here, but if we look at survey data, over in 1999, 86% of voters in Indonesia said they were close to a political party. By 2019, 10%. And in the most recent polls, 1 to 3%, right? So there's been this complete decoupling, deinstitutionalization of the party system. And we can talk about why that is. A lot of it has to do with the switch to open list proportional representation. But a long answer to a very good question, but one that's worth grappling with and thinking about because it's fundamental to how democracy works.
Okay, so Rahma, it's a very fruitful discussion between Pak Allen and Rahma. It's very interesting. Probably we move to our second question. Petran, introduce yourself, please, and ask Pak Allen.
Hello, Pak. My name is Petran Junior. I was so much interested on what you just stated before about how the politician is having a lot of tactics in gaining the numbers of voters. how they manipulate people with the power of the money. That is the irony that we could still saw in this reality, like in my region, like just what you just stated, the broken road. It is just stay broken. But when the election is near, it is the people is giving concern about the road itself. It just got renew, and it is got like renew. My question is about the money politics that you have stated. The concept where the politician just giving money or other stuff that people need, so that the people have that kind of burden of death of uh, moral moral duty like that. So in this time where people get more educated about politics, where people can get ease to get informations by the digital and the internet era, will these tactics of money politics would still exist and survive for further more time, or it just gonna just turns out to be something different and advanced forms of models of this money politics in the future? Thank you, sir. Sorry if
Great
it is.
question. Yeah, thank you, Bertrand. So let me, so a few different ways we can jump into that question. So will it change in the future? Possibly. These things often end up being very resilient and adapting over time. But we know that as incomes rise, politicians often start to switch to other strategies because it becomes more, it becomes more expensive to give voters cash, for example. It's more effective to do other kinds of things. So you see less vote buying. You still see patronage, but less vote buying, for example, in urban areas than you do in rural areas on average. There's differences there. Let me, so as Indonesia develops, as incomes rise, we might expect to see more of that, or sorry, less of vote buying, more of policy, more of pork. But also a portion of that is, has to do with, part of what drives this is vulnerability among voters, right? Voters who need stuff that the state is not delivering. So one of the ways that vote buying is often combated when it's done is reduce the need for voters, reduce the need for your village or your community to have someone fix the road because the state's already done that. So you improve the capacity of the state to deliver goods and services. You reduce the need for voters to turn to a politician to help them get to the hospital or to someone to help fix the road because the state's doing that. So as vulnerability decreases, either because incomes rise or because the state gets better at producing those services, the incentives and opportunities for patronage and can decrease. Now they won't disappear, but they can decrease. One thing that I want to just comment on that you mentioned about for moral obligation. So when we did this study, we expected to see a lot of evidence of that moral obligation, right? That voters, when they receive a handout, feel that obligation to vote for the candidate. And there's actually term, and I'm sure there's Indonesian terms for this in the Philippines. It's called utang na loob. It's the debt of gratitude you feel. But in reality, when we interviewed and surveyed voters and brokers and politicians, very little of that. Right, so that, and that's actually quite good because that means voters are more free agents. So even so, for example, we asked voters what would happen if the broker or candidate that gave you money learned that you didn't vote at all or you voted for someone else, and almost all of them said nothing. Right, nothing would happen. I'm not worried about anything. A few said they might scold me, or I might be a little embarrassed, but nobody worried about. Almost nobody worried about more dire repercussions, right? That they'd be punished somehow. And if we ask voters and candidates, what would you do if you found out the voter you gave money to didn't vote or voted for the other side or a different candidate? What would you do? And almost all of them said we couldn't do anything, right? Some said, well, we wouldn't. In the future, we might not be able to. We wouldn't give them stuff if they asked for help. But most of them said we couldn't do anything. And in fact, brokers and voters, brokers and candidates know that these things aren't very effective. In fact, they have they use the term margin error, right? When they're calculating who they're giving money to, they expect that a lot of that money will just be wasted. They hope for 75% return on this money. They say that they get 50%. When we actually look at the data, we can actually measure this. They get, even the best ones don't get more than 20-25%, right? So this money is not actually capturing voters in the way that sometimes we fear it is. Politicians have to do this because if you're the only politician who doesn't do this, you lose, right? But it's not buying voters in the way that we traditionally think about it. It's doing three things, we argue. One, it is signaling your viability and credibility. You're telling people, I'm a credible candidate, and you're telling your brokers, your team success, that you're a viable candidate. If you don't do this, then people don't think you're really you're really viable. Second, it's brand building. It's just letting voters know you're there, right? It's it's like political advertising. And then third, we call it turf protection. You're protecting voters who have some tie to you, but who, if you don't pay, aren't that loyal. Will go to someone else. So again, voters are much less captured than sometimes we think. And from the voter perspective, they're being completely reasonable, right? This is one voter we talked about as harvest time, right? This is where we can get stuff from the government, from politicians that otherwise we don't get, and we'll make our decisions based on a variety of different factors. Now, somebody mentioned in the comments there about coercion. So that is different, right? So there is sometimes in some places, and we talk about this in this book, which I'm happy to send people if they want. There are places where you have vote buying along with coercion. And that's a different story, right? Then voters really don't have a choice, really can't defect or risk, physical violence if they defect, or threats if they defect. But what we find in our surveys is those areas are actually pretty limited. Most voters, less than 2% of voters, live in those kinds of areas where they feel the risk of physical punishment. Now, where that does exist, that is real and a concern. But that's not most voters, right? So those are particular areas, and I don't know, Ikas, where you're from or where you live, but we find generally that those tend to be areas where you've got strong local political mafias or machines, where you have often places where you have like palm oil areas or natural resource areas. You get patronage married with coercion, and that you're exactly right. That's a different story, but that's not the major story. That's not the most common story in Indonesia and the Philippines, at least according to our data.
Wow. From Pak Allen, responding Bertrand's question, so that we can say that sometimes that the prospect of programmatic politics is still far away, because the relations between the party politics and then the voters and brokerage is hard to make people see that political party ID is something that important to maturizing our democracy and our political party system. Okay, welcome Pak Beni Setiawan. Selamat datang Pak Beni. Pak Allen, Pak Beni is Secretary of Communication Science Department, one of our senior lecturer. He is with us now, Selamat datang Pak Beni selaku Sekretaris Program Studi Ilmu Komunikasi. Selamat bergabung. Probably Pak Beni, there is question or probably insight for us that want to be discussed. It will be very great for us, Pak Beni. Thank you. Terima kasih. Okay, friends, ladies and gentlemen, is there any question, response, or probably something that want to be discussed with Pak Allen Oke, mungkin dari Rahma, probably from Rahma or Bertrand. Oh, Kelana. Yeah, please.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. Hello, Mr. Alan. I'm Klana. So actually, I saw a lot of polarization in the Indonesian president election. In at least the two edition for me, I saw that the Prabowo side seem likely get to cooperate with certain religious group to win this election. So how do you analyze the strategy that carried out by his team says? And is this kind of strategy like using the issues of religion, ethnicity, and race to win the election is also happen in other Southeast Asia countries election? Thank you.
Great question. Thank you for that. So the one of the things that makes that undermines those two pillars I talked about, losers consent, winners restraint, is political polarization. So the extent to which we see political polarization emerging in Indonesia is really worrying for the health of democracy, because that tends to lead to people seeing politics as completely win or lose, right? Either my side wins or we lose, and it tends to drive, make them less likely to accept the results if they're not on the winning side. We have data on this in the publication that I think we mentioned. I talk about some of this data. We have data to indicate that you're right, polarization has increased in Indonesia over the last couple of election cycles. It's and that part of that polarization is driven by the appeal to certain religious groups. We see that elsewhere in Southeast Asia, the marriage of religion and partisanship is most evident in Malaysia. Although we don't see quite as much polarization, although we do we do see some polarization, but the shifting coalitions in Malaysia have sort of kept have made that complicated now. What in Indonesia is interesting. So what I don't know, and I'd love to hear your views on this. How much is this the new normal for Indonesian politics? How much of this is a temporary product of two elections in a row with the same two candidates, right? Because if you look at voters, we survey voters, they're not deeply attached to either party. They're not deeply attached to either candidates, but we just had two elections that featured the same two people that produced some polarization, but also after the election, Prabowo joins the cabinet, right? So Indonesia, it's certainly something to watch and worry about in Indonesia, but it doesn't seem to me to be the level yet that we saw in Thailand that led to a full democratic breakdown, right? So it's worrying, and it's worrying not just on the Prabowo side, but also on the Jokowi side, the policies against religious groups that the government sees as problematic, that involve restrictions on speech and assembly and things like that we worry that those are definitely worrying signs. I think that there are things to watch, but I don't think we've got to the point yet in Thailand where one side just completely rejects democracy and tries to seize power through other means. But that's something we want to watch, because if that polarization continues in this next election, then we worry, and particularly if after the election there is lasting accusations by the loser that the elections were rigged or they were unfair or they refused to accept election results, as is happening in the United States right now. After 2 years after an election, we have one party, at least segments of one party, who refuse to accept election results. That's a bad sign for U.S. democracy. So far, that hasn't happened in either Philippines or Indonesia for an extensive period of time. Prabowo kind of hinted at that and played with that a little bit, but didn't seem to stick. You want to watch that really closely the next election.
Thank you, Mr. Alan.
Good question.
Okay, good question. We seeing the many phenomenon, on Indonesia's and Southeast Asia democracy. ranging from patronage and then polarization based on ethnicity and religious identity exploitation. Yeah, it's very interesting, but yet it must be solved. Yeah, because it can be a pathology. Yeah, pathology for our future democracy if we still see it as something that normal. Yeah, tadi previously Pak Allen already warned us that if we are not aware with this, the risk that that can be exploited in the future, yeah, on our democracy, it will be too late. Yeah, okay, baik, thank you, Kelana. Kemudian yang lain, okay, next, who wants to discuss? It's okay in Indonesian first. Our friends will help you to translate into English. Okay, doesn't matter. Silakan. Probably Amal, Ikhlas Hoiru Amal, thank you for your help to translate the whole discussion. Yeah, probably you have something to discuss, Amal.
Think but I have anything in mind right now because I just have like from the internet. So I have in mind.
Amal,
I'm sorry.
Amal, apologize, Amal, your sound is need to be repaired, I guess. Putus-putus. Okay. Probably you need to change to another device. Okay.
So while we're waiting, let me just say something about
Yeah.
And just your comment sparked something about that I want to just mention. So why do we worry about patronage politics and vote buying if it's not the case that, with some exceptions, voters aren't captured, right? If it's getting voters, if voters are getting stuff that they wouldn't otherwise get, right? Those are seem like good things. So we worry about it for a couple of reasons. So first, it's expensive, right? Politicians have to, and politicians have to raise the money to do this somehow, and that means that either they're personally wealthy, which sometimes happens, so we get only certain kinds of people running, or they're indebted to donors who can help fund these campaigns, or they have to be corrupt to be able to raise the money to do this. So those things are all problematic. And then it's also associated with, patronage politics is also associated with a less efficient delivery of public services, right? And that can lead to people being, both those things can lead to people being disillusioned with politics, disillusioned with elections and parties, and disillusioned with democracy. And so that is concerning, right? Because it eats, as you mentioned, it kind of eats the foundation of democratic performance in ways that can open the door for people who come in and say, democracy is not working, let's do something else, right?
Yes. Yes, that's the one of the high risk and high cost that we will face if we don't improve our democracy and still believe in patronage relations. Ya, itu adalah harga mahal yang harus dibayar, teman-teman, ketika kita masih menggunakan pola komunikasi patronase, gitu ya. Pelayanan publik or public services will be not in good quality and good condition because it absorbed and diverted to winning the contestation in electoral contest, gitu ya, hanya untuk digunakan untuk memenangkan pemilu, ya, dana-dana penting pajak kita, our taxations diverted, gitu ya, dan kemudian tadi then at last there will be some parties, gitu ya, or some factions, gitu ya, that will say democracy is not working, so how if we go to authoritarian turn, ya, it's a kind of temptation, ya, Pak Allen, ya, it's a kind of godaan, gitu ya. Kita kemudian akan we will not believe in democracy anymore, ya. Democracy is high cost. Democracy is there's too noisy in democracy, ya. Terlalu rame demokrasi itu. Why we not take authoritarian turn? Why we not trace back or kembali lagi ke zaman dulu, di mana ketertiban social order and political order it's more ideal for us. Yeah, like a kind of the temptation is to pick, ya, to avoid kalau kita seperti itu, teman-teman. Oke. Any questions or any discussion? Silakan. Oke, Petran, go on.
Thank you for the chance. Maybe I wanted to ask the questions about the Black campaign that has been the phenomenon about the it is just helped by the internet era where people can get easily spreading information. It's like in the recent elections, like Jokowi is stated to be supporting Chinese or foreign people, and Prabowo is closest to the military forces, like that. How do you see Black campaign is uses the dynamics of Black campaign uses for the election for the politicians elections? Thank you, Mr.
Yeah, and I forgot, Bertrand, because you asked last time in the first question about the role of social media and things. Yeah, that is a whole nother dimension it doesn't change the fundamental nature of politics, but in my mind, but it reinforces, it has opportunity to reinforce some of the bad tendencies. So Black campaigning always existed, right? Black information was always there, but it now makes it much easier to spread, and you can spread it much wider, more quickly, and more cheaply. So that's a real concern. It's been a concern in Indonesia. It was a huge concern in the last Philippines elections, and frankly, democracies are as yet pretty ill-equipped to handle these things. It's really hard to figure out how to do this. In non-democracies, the way they do this is by in Singapore, they just passed a law that restricts the kinds of things you can do, right? In some democracies, they have laws about what kinds of things can be posted on social media around elections. That's one way to approach this. Other countries have approached it with fact-checking and those kinds of things. But the challenge is, you can regulate what candidates do and what parties do. It's much harder to regulate what voters are doing. And we know that not just in Indonesia, but also groups outside Indonesia, China, other play, Russia, have messaged, have messages to Indonesian citizens and voters to try and affect outcomes. So I don't have a good answer for how you combat that, Bertrand. That's something that's an active, ongoing agenda for by lots of people to try and figure that out. But it does make election campaigning for national offices a more challenging thing for voters and for democracy. For local races, Bupati, local regional assemblies, things like that, maybe less important, but still a factor that we've got to grapple with and figure out. It is a real threat to democracy and democratic stability. It can also be a blessing, right? It can allow candidates to connect with voters more effectively, more cheaply, allow their messages to spread. But the real challenge is, how do we separate out the good information from the misinformation? And how do we give voters tools to be able to do that effectively? That is a real challenge in all democracies, not just in Indonesia.
Okay, Petran, how's your response?
So about the Black campaign itself, it's not about the problems in Indonesia itself. It is running all around the world. Right?
Yeah.
But how does this significantly affect the democracy itself, Mr.?
So, this is a couple of ways. So remember, I talked about polarization. Social media kinds of campaigns can feed into polarization. So that's a concern. It can also feed distrust of information generally. So we worry about people just when you have discussions about fake news, the people stop believing trusted sources, even trusted sources. So when you have when you have so much trash, it's hard for people to figure out what's the good stuff and what's the trash. So that's a problem. So in those two ways, there's other ways as well, but in those two ways, it can increase polarization, and it can decrease people's trust in political information generally, trust in the government, trust in news, in reliable news sources. All those things are problematic for the long-term health of democracy.
Thank you, Mr.
Okay, interesting. Rahma, seems like you want to respond or discuss something again. Go on.
Okay, thank you for your time. I want to bring back the discussion about patronage and how the candidates offer goods for the public, so they vote for them. We see this often in Southeast Asian countries, and I'm wondering if it has anything to do with the state of our country, meaning is it because our country is a developing country, or is it just a tradition that goes on, or is there a same thing in other developing countries, in other continents? Because usually the goods are very specific, whether it be money or books, like you mentioned earlier in your PowerPoint. If Indonesia does move in the spectrum you mentioned earlier, where America and Indonesia, more to the middle, do you think this kind of tactic will still exist, or will it change over time?
Yeah, so good, all great questions, Rama. So is Indonesia or Southeast Asia unique, right? So I've heard some people say, well, it's culture, right? It's just it's gift-giving cultures, or cultures of hierarchy and respect for leaders and things like that. I don't find those arguments very persuasive, because this happens in lots and lots of democracies around the world. This is really prominent in Africa. It's really prominent in Latin America. It's been prominent in parts of Europe. It was prominent in 19th century US politics. This is not prominent in Japan, right? So this is different forms, but these kinds of patronage politics are not yet all unique. In fact, I was just at a big conference where we were presenting our book, and the panelists on the book who were discussing our book and criticizing our book were people, was a scholar who works on Latin America, a scholar who works on the Middle East, a scholar who works on Africa, a scholar who works on South Asia, and a scholar who works on Japan, right? So this is something that people study all around the world. It does tend to be more common in democracies where with lower levels of economic development, but it's not unknown in more wealthy democracies. Italy, this was very common until the patronage politics was kind of the rule in Italy until the mid 1990s, early 2000s as well. So not uncommon, and Indonesia is in no way unique here. But these things can evolve and can change over time. So let me just give you a negative example first. This wasn't always the rule in Indonesia, right? Again, 20 years ago, if you ran in 2004, the parties were doing some of this, some of the local public goods provision, fixing roads, things like that, but almost no giving cash to voters. Right. And in 2009, even there wasn't that much. It really is 2014 where this really kicks in. 2014, 2015, and 2019. To the extent that politicians were shocked. We interviewed politicians who had run in 2004, didn't run in 2009, ran again in 2014. And elections were 10 times as expensive, right? They just weren't ready for this shift. Politicians don't like this new arrangement, right? It's costly. So we see a dramatic change in Indonesia for the worse, I think. But that also suggests we can see changes for the better. So you're right. These things may not probably never disappear completely, but we want to think about here's how I think about it. What incentives, what are the tools that candidates have to mobilize voters? And they're going to use whatever tools, none of the tools are going to be perfect. They're going to use lots of different tools, as many as they can. But we want to do things that try and incentivize them to use certain tools and make other tools less attractive, less costly. Right now, Indonesia's electoral system, open list proportional representation, makes party tools completely unattractive and makes personal tools like vote buying really, really important. So you can imagine institutional reforms that might change that equation somewhat. That's what happened in Thailand, where party tools can become more valuable, where personal tools become less valuable. And so candidates have more incentives to campaign on the party lists and on the party reputation. So let me just give you really quickly, a couple of comparisons in Southeast Asia where we don't see cash to voters. We see other forms of patronage, but not cash to voters. East Timor, very similar, cultural, similar cultural attitudes, although some important differences, but some shared history, low-level economic developments, some institutions that might suggest vote buying at the local level would be possible, but almost none of it. It's just very rare. You see other kinds of patronage, but not cash to voters. Malaysia, almost no cash to voters. Sabah and Sarawak, exception there, but mainly the peninsula, almost no cash to voters. Instead, you see lots of public goods, lots of pork and particularism and patronage, but at the party level, at the collective level rather than the individual level. So I don't think Indonesia is trapped here forever. There are things that could change the equilibrium and give politicians new incentives. Some of those could be institutional reforms. Some of those could be governance reforms. Some of those could be Indonesian voters becoming more wealthy, becoming more less reliant on politicians for handouts. But this doesn't have to. You don't have to be stuck here forever. But it's not easy to change either. Great question.
Okay, it's a lot of insight we have tonight, friends. Yeah, it seems that Imro, you raise your hand at previous. Is there something that you want to discuss with us, with Pak Alen? Okay. Probably, Rahma, is there any response to Pak Alen's answer to you?
I think I have a little bit of question, but you could probably reiterate, because you said before Indonesia doesn't have to stay in this position forever. But if one of the parties does not do that, they tend to lose. So it's really hard to break that cycle. How do you think we should break this? It's really really complicated way to go around this problem.
You're exactly right. No, so it can't work by one politician saying, I'm going to be clean, right? Politicians say that, but they almost never are, right? Because when it comes to elections, their brokers won't work for them and embarrassed to work for them if they're not getting any money to distribute. So often we interview candidates who will go to urban areas, middle class voters, and say money politics is bad, and then they'll go to the other areas and they'll give out money to voters. So you're right. Those kinds of reforms are hard. We do see pockets in Indonesia and Philippines where you see different politics emerging. Often those are in urban reform areas. So you can think about examples in Indonesia where politicians try and create sort of new political economies that provide different incentives. But really, what your question suggests, Rama, is that this has to be systematic, right? Changes usually happen as a result of sort of major changes to the incentives of all politicians, not just one politician saying, I'm going to do something different. So that, again, that could be constitutional reform that changes, that's what put Indonesia in this path to begin with, right? It could be major reforms of public services. So conditional cash transfers is one tool that could help change things. And then more gradual things like developments, party system development, those things can help. But for quick changes, it's usually as a result of some major institutional reform. So in the U.S., one thing that happened to get rid of or to reduce these kind of patronage politics in the United States, not eliminate it, it still exists in some forms, but was a reform of the bureaucracy. So parties used to be able to put their own folks in the bureaucracy. The bureaucracy would give a kickback to the parties as part of their salary. And one of the things that happened was a reform of the bureaucracy where parties were kind of kicked out of the bureaucracy, and there was a civil service exam, and parties also, there was reforms that made it harder for party bosses to control their parties. So there was a series of reforms that made it harder for parties to do the things that they had done in the past. Italy also a set of reforms that reduced the tools that parties had to use and made it and increased the rewards for campaigning based on party labels. So it often is going to take, because you're right, because this is an equilibrium where if one person tries to do something different, they're not going to win. It usually takes something systematic, right? Some sort of system level reforms, sometimes as a result of a crisis where people are really unhappy, or sometimes as a result of reformers who say we can do something better.
Okay, yeah, it's makin malam makin hangat ya. It's getting warm. The discussion is getting very interesting. Okay, I have spotted about Rahma's question and then response by Pak Alen about the difficulties if politicians try to fix the problems on democracy alone. Yeah, he said that let's fight money politics, let's fight kind of patronage and clientelism and so on. Yeah, but if he did it by himself, it's almost impossible. I remember that Pak Ed Aspinal said that the problem of money politics, patronage, and clientelism, especially in Indonesia, is already become what we call as collective action problem. That we can't combat the pathology, ya. Kita tidak bisa memerangi politik uang, teman-teman, hanya dengan seorang diri. Kita berkata, we said that I will fight corruption, I will fight patronage and clientelism, but the system itself didn't give us any opportunity to make a better condition and better regulation to combating the situation. It can like that, Pak Alen, what I remember from him about the collective action problem. Okay, probably Pak Alen have something to say or something to discuss to us. Okay.
Well, I just say that you're exactly right. So the specific collective action problem of a variety of forms, but it's sometimes we call it prisoner's dilemma, right? We'd all be better off if we could cooperate on a new outcome where none of us do this. And candidates would like that. Voters would be better off. But if only one person does it, we call it the suckers payoff, right? They're the ones who suffer and everybody else wins. So time and time again, we would interview candidates who would start, often very sincerely, start with a determination not to buy votes. And then as the elections got closer and closer, they would hear from their brokers, they would hear from their team success members, and get pressure from them. And if they stuck to their guns, they would almost always lose. More often than not, they would give in and do some of it, right? As a price for paying for again, the sort of entry fee that you have to pay to be to be considered a part of politics. So you're right. One of the solutions to collective action problems often are new institutions, right? Institutions that change the incentives. It's hard to do that because politicians often like the institutions that they're using because they're winning under those institutions. But I do think there's an opportunity in Indonesia to change because politicians don't like this set of institutions. Every one of them complains to us about this. They don't do this because they love to give money to voters, right? They would rather be doing other things, but they do it because that's what the game is, and they're playing that game. So maybe there's a coalition in support of different kinds of reforms, but there's trade-offs again. So if you move to a system where voters aren't a closed list PR like Indonesia used to have, voters have less choice over candidates, right? They can only choose parties, and there's a cost there. There's a trade-off there. But then the Indonesians have to decide where they want to fall in that trade-off. But that is, but if something's going to happen quickly, it almost always has to come from some sort of major structural, institutional kind of change, reform that changes the nature of the game, changes the nature of incentives for all politicians at once, rather than some one lone, reformer who's going to try and change the system on their own. And we respect and admire those reformers, but they often don't win, and there's not enough of them usually to change the system in the short term.
Okay, yeah. It's a long to go to improve our democracy, friends, teman-teman sekalian, and of course the improvement for our political and party system it's still on progress, and we hope that we can be the part of the to improve the collective action problem that Mr. Allen and his friends said in many of Allen and his friends' writings. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, it's very insightful, fruitful discussion. But yeah, we still have 2 minutes left with Pak Allen. In Singapore, is it 10 p.m. or 9 p.m. Pak Allen?
9:30 p.m.
Okay, 9:20. It's already late night in Singapore, ya, teman-teman. Okay, probably Pak Allen, as like concluding remarks, what can you recommend to Indonesia's democracy, to improve their situation? I'm so sorry. Okay, to improve Indonesia's democracy, based on judging from the political situation nowadays. Probably you can give us concluding remarks on it.
Yeah, so I guess I will say 3 things. So one is, the best hope for Indonesian democracy are Indonesians like all of you, right? Who are interested in these things, who are engaged, who are thinking about how to reform. We can disagree about how to change, how to reform, but engagement is so much better than disengagement or disillusionment or washing my hands and saying everything's bad, it's hopeless. So my first plea would be to not give up, to recognize that every democracy is flawed, that Indonesia, compared to lots of democracies around the world, is actually doing quite well. There's lots of flaws and challenges within Indonesian democracy, no doubt. But I'd rather have Indonesia's democracy than Thailand's right now, right? So there are, so we see the glass half empty, and that's okay, but we also want to recognize that there is water in the glass, right? The glass is not fully empty. So don't give up hope, keep working and keep fighting for a better democracy. That's the first thing. Second is, don't fall prey to polarization at the individual and within the groups that you're part of. It's so easy and it's so tempting, right? There are groups in the United States politics that I disagree with all my heart and soul, right? Who I can't believe they believe the ways they do, and that they support the policies they support. And it's really easy to dismiss those folks and those parties as ignorant or evil or contemptible. But it's incumbent that we not do that. That we fight on ideas, but that we don't. We try and avoid the polarization, the us versus them rhetoric, because that feeds into populists and those who can then use those divisions to destroy democracy. And then the third thing, I guess, would be back to our discussion of reforms, is to think, debate, propose institutional reform, right? That is, those they're not panaceas. They don't fix everything. There's always unintended consequences. but be thinking about and debating and pressing for reforms that could improve Indonesian democracy. So those are the three things that sort of come to mind.
Thank you very much, Pak Alen, for your concluding remarks and your knowledge that you already shared to us. Yeah, it will be a good trigger to us to discuss and working on to improve democracy. Yeah, thank you for your insight, and I hope you are enjoying to discuss your findings and then your writings with us from Communication Studies State University of Yogyakarta. We are very happy, we are very glad to have you here. We also say apologize if there is something that you are not tidak berkenan, ya, you are not welcome with it, with the probably I have a not fluent English or something else gitu ya. Okay.
It's been an honor and it's been wonderful. I've really enjoyed the conversation and thank you for inviting me. Thank you.
Yeah, we thank you too to Pak Alen. Okay. Probably Mas Reza, can we have a photo session with Pak Alen? Yeah, for memorabilia with Pak Alen, ya, ini it's a very kesempatan langka, ya, it's a rare situation we have Pak Alen. Okay. Mungkin Mas Reza boleh membantu untuk memfotokan kita. Oke, teman-teman, boleh kita on cam dulu, we on cam ya, to take photo with Pak Alen, gitu ya, untuk kenang-kenangan, silakan.
Oke, saya bantu untuk screenshot ya, Mas.
Ya, siap. Terima kasih.
Okay, now I will screenshot. 1, 2, 3. Okay. Once more. For those who have not joined us. 1, 2. Okay. There's some more adding. Okay. 1, 2, 3. Okay. Okay, done. Thank you.
Okay, yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Mbak. Thank you, Mbak. Thank you, Mas. And then thank you, Pak Alen. Terima kasih sekali lagi for your visit as guest speaker in here. And teman-teman, ya, friends from Communication Department State University of Yogyakarta, Pak Beni Setiawan, ya, thank you for your coming in this discussion. Allow me to close this discussion, Pak Alen. Hope you can visit us in Yogyakarta. Yeah, probably we can discuss with our students in here. Thank you very much, Pak Alen. Thank you very much, teman-teman dan Pak Beni. Okay, have a nice day. Ya, sama-sama Pak Alen. Have a nice day.
Thank you.
Thank you, teman-teman.